When you think of medieval life, you might easily conjure images of jousting knights, grand feasts in castle halls, or merry fairs with wandering minstrels. But for the average medieval peasant, especially when the biting winds of winter began to howl, reality was a far grimmer affair. Winter wasn't just a season, it was an annual, brutal test of endurance, a relentless assault that didn't believe in second chances. Every dawn that broke, revealing you still breathing, and with all your extremities accounted for, was considered nothing short of a minor miracle, perhaps worth celebrating with a slightly less frozen turnip for breakfast. Surviving a medieval winter wasn't about finding comfort, it was about gritting your teeth, piling on every piece of scratchy cloth you owned, huddling close to whatever source of warmth you could find, and praying you didn't wake up with icicles dangling from your eyebrows. And the true adventure of mere survival, it was just beginning. Before we descend into this often uncomfortable truth, tell me, where are you tuning in from tonight? Are you nestled in a cozy modern home, perhaps enduring a long commute, or simply seeking a moment of quiet reflection, hidden from the general chaos of life? Drop a comment below and let me know your location and the time. And if this kind of unvarnished storytelling brings you even a sliver of peace, or at least keeps you from the endless scroll of modern anxieties, then a quick like and subscribe would be deeply appreciated. It's oddly comforting to know who else is drifting off to the same slow march through history. If you ever thought your modern apartment was drafty because a window doesn't quite seal properly, medieval peasants would likely scoff and ask for a word. Their homes weren't just drafty, they were, to put it politely, very enthusiastic wind tunnels with a roof. Most peasant houses were constructed using what historians euphemistically term wattle and daub. Translation: a rudimentary framework of interwoven sticks and branches, crisscrossed like a giant haphazard basket. This skeletal structure was then smeared, lovingly if you can believe it, with a charming and surprisingly effective mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. Yes, dung. They weren't trying to be intentionally gross. Animal dung was readily available, cheap, and possessed excellent binding and insulating properties. These walls, no matter how thickly or lovingly smeared, stood little chance against a proper, raging winter storm. The cold wind, an omnipresent and malevolent force, found every minute crack, every tiny gap, every imperceptible crevice, and gleefully danced its way into the single-room homes, swirling around and making absolutely sure you never got too comfortable. Privacy? Absolutely not. Warmth? Not really. Character building? Oh, most definitely. And then there were the roofs. Often made of thatch, these roofs certainly looked picturesque in summer, but after a few relentless months of rain, snow, and brutal winds, they sagged, leaked incessantly, and occasionally offered an unwelcome, feathery entrance to local wildlife. Nothing quite says pleasant evening at home like a bewildered squirrel or a confused bird unexpectedly dropping onto your dinner. Windows, if they existed at all in a peasant's hovel, were laughably tiny, mere holes often covered with thin animal hides or simple wooden shutters. Glass was an astronomical luxury, so expensive that even the wealthiest lord of the manor likely couldn't afford more than a single tiny pane. And peasants, they were just genuinely happy if the wind didn't rip the entire cowhide covering right off the wall in the middle of a blizzard. To make matters even worse, floors were usually just compacted dirt. When it rained or snowed heavily, groundwater and mud would seep up through the ground, transforming your humble abode into something akin to a very personal, very muddy, indoor water feature. Not that anyone appreciated it during winter. Every step inside your own home could feel like trudging across a frozen marsh, the cold seeping up from below, assaulting you from above, and infiltrating from every side. It was a three-dimensional assault on your precious body heat. But medieval peasants weren't the type to simply whine and give up. They were masters of improvisation. They packed gaps in the walls and around doorways with whatever they could find. Moss, old rags, bundles of dry grass, even animal hair if it was soft and squishy enough. They learned to huddle close to each other, using human bodies as insulation at its most primal and effective. Creativity, sheer stubbornness, and sometimes a bit of sheep grease rubbed into the walls were often the only things standing between them and becoming medieval popsicles. Because if your house was perpetually falling apart, and your best protection against the elements involved mud and goat hair, well, at least you could try to laugh about it. Sort of, if your teeth weren't chattering too hard. As if the freezing air and porous walls weren't enough, medieval peasants also had to battle a silent, relentless enemy rising from below, the frozen ground itself. Floors weren't really floors in the modern sense. They were merely slightly flatter, perhaps marginally tamped down, patches of earth inside your home. If you were lucky, truly, miraculously lucky, someone might have thrown down some straw or old rushes to give you the bare illusion of comfort. But make no mistake, you were sleeping, working, and living barely an inch or two away from the cold, hard, unforgiving dirt. And that cold, that insidious, relentless cold, was a true malevolent force. It seeped up from the earth like an evil little ghost, a chilling vapor worming its way through the thin layers of straw, into your rough garments, into your very bones, and straight into your soul. If you accidentally dropped anything onto the floor during a winter night, a tool, a piece of bread, a desperate tear, congratulations. It was now inextricably part of the permafrost, probably to be chipped free in the morning. Medieval peasants, in their ingenious desperation, tried to fight this grim underground battle in a few practical ways. One common method was layering thick mats of straw across the floor. If you could afford to buy it, or more realistically, if you could stealthily acquire enough of it from your neighbor's field without getting caught, you might achieve a somewhat decent insulating barrier. But straw, being straw, flattened fast under constant foot traffic. It also got moldy even faster, especially when exposed to moisture from the earthen floor or human and animal exhalations. This added an extra crunchy, damp soundtrack to your already miserable short nights. Some homes layered dried rushes onto the dirt instead, which offered a slightly more structured mat. Every so often, they would simply throw fresh rushes on top, without the laborious process of cleaning out the old, compacted, decomposing ones. Over time, this created a fascinating, multi-layered ecosystem, decomposing plants, a thriving population of fleas, lice, and whatever other mystery creatures decided to move in for the winter. It was basically medieval carpet padding, if your carpet was alive, slightly damp, and perpetually smelled like a wet dog that just rolled in a compost heap. Beds, for those who even had them, didn't offer much respite from the chilling ground. They were usually little more than crude wooden frames packed with, you guessed it, more straw or hay. Instead of cozy, conforming mattresses, you had poking, shifting, crunchy layers that did little to block the relentless cold radiating up from below. Tossing and turning in the night wasn't about finding a comfortable position. It was a desperate, awkward dance to keep blood flowing, numb limbs from freezing, and to redistribute the pressure points that made sleeping agony. The truth is, medieval peasants didn't conquer the icy ground so much as learn to live uncomfortably, perpetually aware of it, directly above it. A good night's sleep wasn't about dreams or softness. It was about the profound relief of waking up with all your toes still attached and your fingers still functional. And if you could pull that off, hey, you were already doing better than most. If a medieval home had a single, undisputed hero during winter, it wasn't the leaky roof, nor the drafty walls, nor even the brave layers of dirt and dung insulation. No, the true champion was the hearth, a crackling, smoky, often stubborn fire pit that served as the only real, consistent defense against the cold, the encroaching darkness, and the pervasive gloom of medieval life. At the absolute center of nearly every peasant home, acting as its beating heart, was a simple fire. Forget the grand stone fireplaces with ornate mantles you see in movies. Forget the neat chimneys sweeping smoke skyward. Instead, you had a basic pit dug into the dirt floor, or a small pile of stones, upon which some half-burned logs smoldered, and enough smoke poured into the room to make you genuinely wonder if you were slowly, inevitably becoming a human ham, perpetually cured by the indoor atmosphere. That's right, most peasant homes didn't even have chimneys. Smoke simply did its best. It drifted lazily out through small, haphazard holes in the roof, seeped through cracks in the walls, or more often than not, simply hung heavy in the air, drifting right into your lungs if it was feeling particularly lazy that evening. It certainly wasn't ideal for breathing, nor for your overall long-term lifespan. But on the bright side, it did a surprisingly effective job of fumigating fleas and other unwanted insect guests. Who needs pest control when you're essentially marinating in smoke 24/7? The hearth wasn't just about warmth either, although that was its primary function. It was the kitchen, the sole source of light after sunset, and sometimes even the medieval version of a television. People instinctively gravitated towards the fire, sitting around its flickering glow, telling stories, sharing gossip, or simply staring into the hypnotic flames because, frankly, there wasn't much else to do after the sun had set. Keeping this precious fire alive wasn't just a nice idea or a comforting habit. It was mandatory, a matter of life and death. Letting the fire die out overnight was akin to putting up a welcome sign for the cold, inviting it to come in and finish you off. Plus, reigniting a fire from scratch in the dead of winter wasn't as simple as striking a match. You had to painstakingly work with flint, steel, dry kindling, and offer up more desperate prayers than you'd ever offered before for a single precious spark. Everyone in the family had a crucial duty when it came to the hearth, stoking the flames, watching the embers, carefully adding peat, small sticks, or if you were incredibly lucky, a precious, painstakingly acquired piece of dry wood. It was a constant, exhausting battle between human persistence and the smothering, relentless cold that wanted nothing more than to snuff out every last flicker of warmth and hope. The hearth, in its smoky, sputtering, and often disappointing little way, didn't guarantee survival, but without it, survival was downright impossible. It was the beating, albeit weak and smoky, heart of hope in a medieval winter. If there was one thing medieval peasants feared more than running out of ale, it was letting the crucial fire go out overnight. Without that warm, flickering lifeline, the cold would creep in faster than a tax collector after a good harvest. And in the dead of winter, restarting a fire from scratch wasn't just inconvenient, it could be deadly. Matches didn't exist yet. Lighters were a distant, unimaginable dream. Rekindling a fire meant painstakingly striking flint and steel together, over and over, praying for a single precious spark to catch. Then you had to coddle that spark with tender, painstaking love, carefully nurturing it with whatever dry kindling you hadn't already burned days ago. Imagine trying to do all this in the freezing dark, half asleep, with fingers stiff and clumsy from the cold. Now, for extra motivation, add the hungry howl of a distant wolf. So peasants got smart. They became masters of fire banking. No, not in a cozy savings account, though the concept of preserving assets was similar. Banking the fire meant carefully burying the embers under a mound of ash right before heading to bed. The ash, a superb insulator, acted like a thermal blanket, insulating the glowing coals and keeping them alive, just barely, until morning. If you performed this delicate art correctly, you could stroll over at sunrise, poke the ash pile a little, add fresh wood or kindling, and voila, fire, without the laborious frostbite-inducing ordeal of starting from scratch. But if you did it wrong, if a stray draft or too much dampness infiltrated the ash, well, let's just say mornings got a whole lot colder and a whole lot grumpier. Fire banking was an art form, a critical skill passed down from parent to child, like a prized family recipe. Everyone had their own little secrets, their preferred methods. Some insisted on using only dry ash, others swore a bit of dampness was key to a slow, steady burn. Some packed the embers tight, others let them breathe a little. You could practically start a medieval argument just by suggesting a better fire banking method, complete with passionate gestures and perhaps a few well-aimed clods of mud. It was the ancient version of arguing over barbecue techniques, just with slightly higher survival stakes. Sometimes, even the most expertly banked fire wasn't enough. A howling wind might sneak through an undiscovered crack and snuff it out anyway, or a clumsy sheep might stumble into the hearth, scattering embers. Yes, it happened. That's why some families, in a testament to their dedication to survival, took turns getting up in the dead of the night to check the coals. Basically, the medieval equivalent of sleepwalking to the thermostat, but with far greater consequences. In the end, fire banking was less about mastering nature and more about buying just a few more precious hours of warmth, a fragile reprieve from the encroaching cold. And if you woke up to even a single surviving ember, still faintly glowing in the ash, that was your victory right there, a tiny precious spark of hope, and enough to face another day of battling the cold. In medieval times, the phrase "the more the merrier" wasn't just about parties or festivals, it was a fundamental winter survival tactic. When the fire sputtered pathetically and the freezing winds whistled through every crack in the wattle and daub walls, there was one surefire source of warmth that was always available: each other. And if that meant sleeping cheek to cheek, limb to limb with your entire extended family, a few neighbors, your livestock, and quite possibly a very confused goose, then so be it. Forget about personal space. Privacy wasn't even a recognized concept on the coldest, most desperate nights. The goal wasn't comfort or individual preference. It was the absolute, non-negotiable imperative: don't wake up frozen to the floor. Entire households, sometimes multiple generations, and even unrelated lodgers, would pile into the warmest corner of the single-room house, wrapping themselves in whatever scraps of cloth and rough wool they could find, forming what could best be described as a desperate, snoring human lasagna. Younger children, being smaller and more vulnerable, squeezed in tightly between parents or older siblings, nestled deep in the center of the warmth. Grandparents, with their brittle bones and slower circulation, snuggled under the outer layers, their wisdom a valuable asset in this nightly battle. And if Cousin Ethel showed up unexpectedly, shivering at the door after a disastrous journey, well, there was always room for one more, somehow, somewhere. If you were lucky, truly blessed by the winter gods, you got to sleep in the middle of this human pile, where body heat radiated from all sides, creating a cocoon of relative warmth. If you were unlucky, you were on the precarious edge, the medieval equivalent of sleeping next to the perpetually open door of a meat locker, and woe to the person who dared to move too much during the night. You shifted once to get marginally comfortable, and suddenly you'd inadvertently knocked Aunt Mildred into a freezing draft by the wall. Congratulations, you are now the family villain, and deservedly so. Sometimes even the bedding itself was a shared, communal affair, a single, vast straw mattress that slowly flattened and decomposed under the nightly weight of multiple generations. And because hygiene wasn't exactly winning any awards in medieval times, especially in winter, let's just say it wasn't the most fragrant or appealing sleeping arrangement. But hey, when it's you versus frostbite and hypothermia, you quickly learn to stop being picky. Body heat wasn't just a nice bonus, it was a strategic resource. Some medieval guides and folk wisdom even recommended deliberately arranging the strongest, warmest people on the outside of the group, like living human shields against the cold. Babies and frail elders were tucked deep into the center, treated like the precious, vulnerable heat generators they were. This intense proximity wasn't just about survival, though. Over time, it became a fundamental part of daily life, deeply woven into the fabric of family bonding. Long winter nights huddled together naturally led to storytelling, quiet singing, and undoubtedly some very interesting muffled conversations under the shared wool blankets. So next time your sibling steals your blanket, or your dog shamelessly hogs the entire bed, just remember, at least you're not fighting for elbow space between a snoring uncle and a particularly judgmental goat. If you thought dealing with modern roommates was a challenge, medieval peasants would like to introduce you to their winter housemates. These weren't just fellow humans. We're talking cows, goats, pigs, chickens, basically anything with a pulse and a little bit of body heat to spare. Bringing animals indoors wasn't merely a quaint village tradition or a rustic quirk. It was absolutely vital for survival. Livestock generated a surprising amount of warmth, and in a poorly insulated hovel where the wind howled louder than your stomach on an empty day, every single degree mattered. Plus, if your goat shared a wall with you inside your home, it was slightly less likely to get stolen by a desperate neighbor in the dead of night. 2 birds, 1 stinky stone. At night, the peasant house transformed into a chaotic, living furnace. Chickens nested in corners or on rafters, pigs snorted contentedly near the hearth, and cows lounged luxuriously against the walls, chewing cud as if they paid rent and held a long-term lease. It wasn't glamorous, far from it. If you've ever been stuck in a car on a summer road trip with someone who forgot to shower for a week, imagine that. But it's a cow, it's winter, and there's literally nowhere else to go. The smells were legendary. By springtime, the perfume of a shared winter living space was something truly fierce, a robust blend of smoke, animal waste, unwashed bodies, and damp straw. You didn't need to light a scented candle. Your nostrils were already on a wild, involuntary ride. But medieval peasants developed a selective nose, a kind of sensory blindness to the pervasive odors. They didn't complain much because they understood one uncomfortable, undeniable truth. The more animals inside, the fewer frozen toes and hypothermia cases in the morning. Certain animals even had prime spots in this domestic menagerie. Cows, being the biggest and warmest, usually took center stage near the family, their massive bodies radiating heat. Goats were allowed closer in for their warmth, and frankly, because goats, being goats, would find a way inside anyway. Chickens often roosted in rafters or old baskets, high enough to avoid being stepped on. And pigs, well, pigs didn't care. They plopped down wherever they pleased, probably right in the middle of the only clear patch of floor. Of course, sharing your very intimate sleeping quarters with livestock wasn't without its unique hazards. Imagine drifting off peacefully, only to be rudely awakened by a chicken deciding your hair makes a perfectly good perch, or stepping barefoot into something suspicious first thing in the morning. Yes, medieval mornings could be full of unpleasant surprises. Still, despite the noise, the legendary smells, and the occasional hoof to the ribs, peasants understood the simple, brutal math: cold kills and cows, whether they want to or not, cuddle. In the desperate ongoing battle against winter's icy fingers, a warm, slightly slobbery cow breath was often the deciding factor between life and death, providing those precious few degrees that made all the difference. In medieval winters, fashion wasn't about looking good or keeping up with the latest trends. It was exclusively about not dying. Peasants weren't flipping through fashion catalogues. They were layering up like they were preparing for an epic, never-ending battle against the Grim Reaper himself. The cardinal rule was simple. If you owned it, you wore it, sometimes all at once. First, the basic undertunic, a scratchy, probably not too clean linen shirt. Over that, a thicker woolen tunic. Then another if you were fortunate enough to possess one. Add some leggings that sagged at the knees, a rough, heavy cloak draped over your shoulders, and if you were truly lucky, a patched-up sheepskin thrown on top like a hard-won trophy. Congratulations, you were now approximately 10% warmer and 90% itchier. Boots were a luxury that many peasants simply couldn't afford. Instead, they wrapped their feet in countless layers of cloth or old rags, stuffing them into crude wooden clogs if they had them. If the cold still bit through, well, you just added another rag and hoped you didn't lose a toe to frostbite by morning. And forget about washing all these layers. Washing your clothes in the middle of winter meant dragging them to a frozen stream, smashing through a layer of ice, then laboriously scrubbing them in freezing water, and finally waiting 2 days for your only shirt to dry, if it didn't just freeze solid into a tragic, unwearable ice sculpture in the meantime. Most peasants wisely decided that smelling like a mix of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a small, acceptable price to pay for the much more critical objective of not freezing solid. Interestingly, the pervasive dirt and grease buildup on their clothing had a surprising bonus feature. It provided additional insulation, that thick, grimy layer locked in precious body heat. It was like a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, just smellier and far less socially acceptable in modern company. In fact, some medieval folk genuinely believed that washing oneself too often in winter could actually make you sick, exposing you to the cold. Better to keep that protective holy filth barrier intact, they reasoned. Bathing was rare, laundry even rarer, and soap, when it existed, was reserved for the most serious of occasions, like when the bishop unexpectedly showed up, or perhaps right before you died. Adding to this strategic layering, peasants simply threw their new layers on top of last month's, or even last season's clothes, without changing the ones underneath. Eventually, you became a walking museum of the past 6 weeks, every stain and patch telling the heroic story of that one time you slipped in the mud but didn't die. To outside observers, medieval peasants might have looked and certainly smelled like they had completely given up on hygiene, but the peasants knew better. That grimy, crusty tunic was a thermal shield against death by frostbite. It wasn't glamorous, but neither was freezing to death because you wanted to smell like flowers. Besides, in a world where literally everyone stank to high heaven, you weren't offending anyone particularly. Nose blindness was practically a way of life. So yes, in medieval winters, filth wasn't a sign of failure. It was fashion, it was function, and if you had a thick, greasy outer layer by February, you, my friend, were winning at life. If you thought medieval peasants spent their winters tucked into plush feather beds with intricately embroidered quilts, think again. The reality was a bit more rustic, and by rustic, I mean let's sleep on a pile of dead plants and hope for the best. Beds in the medieval peasant world were usually a rough wooden frame, if you could even afford one, covered with a large sack stuffed full of straw, hay, or old rushes. That's it. No memory foam, no orthopedic support, certainly no 5-star hotel experience. Just a crunchy, lumpy, slightly pokey mess that smelled faintly of barnyard and regret. Every toss and turn in the night brought a delightful soundtrack of crinkling straw and the occasional sharp jab from a rogue stalk of hay. Some peasants even skipped the wooden frame altogether and just threw the straw straight onto the dirt floor, creating a luxurious ground-level sleeping experience that modern influencers would probably rebrand as earth-connected slumber or primal grounding. These straw mattresses weren't just uncomfortable, they were temporary and perpetually in decline. Over time, the straw flattened under constant weight, grew moldy from dampness, attracted bugs like a 5-star resort for insects, and generally turned into a biological hazard zone. Changing the straw was a significant event, a major household chore usually done only a few times a year if you were particularly diligent, or whenever your bed started actively moving without your permission. Rushes were a popular alternative to straw. These long grasses were spread thickly on the floor, sometimes even mixed with fragrant herbs like lavender or rosemary, not for luxury, but to mask the overwhelming, inescapable livestock aroma of daily life. Fresh rushes smelled lovely for about a day. After that, they quickly became part of the muddy, trampled, decomposing landscape inside the house, blending seamlessly with dirt, food scraps, and whatever else wandered in. And let's not forget the ever-present bedfellows. Fleas, lice, and other charming critters absolutely loved straw bedding, almost as much as the peasants themselves did. If you woke up scratching more than you slept, congratulations, you were living the authentic medieval peasant experience. Despite these myriad hardships, these humble beds were genuine lifesavers. Piles of straw provided a crucial insulating layer, however thin, against the frozen earth, and the act of clumping together multiple bodies atop these layers created pockets of shared body heat. Medieval central heating, at its most basic and effective. So next time you sink into your soft, supportive mattress, enjoying the blissful comfort of modern bedding, just remember that somewhere out there, a medieval peasant is looking down at you from history, grinning through a mouthful of missing teeth, and quietly saying, "Must be nice." When you live in a house literally made of sticks, mud, and optimism, you quickly learn that winter breezes aren't just a nuisance, they're personal attacks. Medieval peasants didn't just fight the cold from the outside, they fought it relentlessly from inside their own homes, armed with nothing but whatever they could cram into the cracks. And trust me, there were a lot of cracks. Walls warped, the mud daub crumbled, and the thatch roof sagged. The cold seemed to find new, infuriating places to sneak in every night, like a mischievous poltergeist, with a deeply personal grudge against your comfort. Sealing up the house, or at least attempting to, became an art form, a constant ongoing battle. Peasants stuffed gaps with moss, straw, scraps of old cloth, bundles of dry grass, and sometimes even animal hair, if it was soft, squishy, or vaguely insulating. If it could be jammed into a hole, it was. Some particularly determined souls undertook the grim annual winter project of daubing extra layers of mud and dung over the outside of their walls. Imagine standing there in freezing weather, slapping cold manure onto your own house, while muttering to yourself, "This is fine, this is luxury," because in a way, it absolutely was. Roof leaks were another perpetual battlefield. Thatch, while cheap and plentiful, wasn't exactly waterproof, especially after a few seasons of relentless rain and snow. Peasants would desperately plug holes in the roof with spare bits of cloth, bundles of reeds, or in moments of true desperation, chunks of turf stolen from the nearest field. Every home eventually started to resemble a slightly sad, perpetually damp patchwork quilt, painstakingly made by someone who gave up halfway through. Doors and windows, if you were lucky enough to have them, were little more than crude wooden planks hung by rusty iron nails and sheer stubbornness. Window holes were often covered with animal hides or thick cloth soaked in animal fat to block out the worst drafts, and as a bonus, add a mysterious aroma of vaguely rendered animal products to the living space. Every night was a grueling battle between human ingenuity and the relentless, sneaky cold. One minute you were relatively warm, the next, a sudden gust would find the one spot you missed, slapping you awake like a frosty hand of doom. Yet somehow, through sheer cleverness, grim stubbornness, and a refusal to accept slightly frozen as a permanent state of being, medieval peasants patched, stuffed, and muddled their way through the worst winters nature could throw at them, one muddy handful at a time. When the cold bit hard enough to keep you awake at night, medieval peasants had a solution that would make any modern sleep expert cringe. Don't even try to pretend everyone's sleeping at once. Instead, they developed a survival strategy that today would make any military commander proud, sleeping in shifts. It wasn't some grand, organized system with whistles and roll calls. It was far simpler and much more desperate. Half the household stayed awake, tending to the precious, demanding fire, and patching up any stray drafts that dared to appear, while the other half curled up under threadbare blankets and hay, trying to catch a few precious hours of half-frozen sleep. The fire needed constant attention. Left alone, it would die down, and restarting it, remember, was about as easy as convincing a stubborn donkey to dance a jig. So someone had to be on ember patrol, a vigilant guardian of the warmth. And since no one wanted to actually get up, once they were finally warmish, families rotated shifts. You dozed for a few hours, got unceremoniously elbowed awake by your shift partner, then stumbled over to the hearth to poke, prod, and silently curse the fire back to life, all while trying not to step on a sleeping goat or a disgruntled pig. The rotation wasn't glamorous. There were no night vision goggles, no late-night snacks, and certainly no 5 more minutes snooze buttons. Just stiff joints, heavy eyelids, and a growing internal resentment toward whoever snored loudest during your shift. Children old enough to hold a stick were quickly pressed into service, learning early that in winter, everyone pulled their weight or risked freezing trying. Grandparents sometimes stayed by the fire for longer stretches, both because of their accumulated experience in fire management, and frankly because arthritis made lying down and getting up again a truly monumental event. And when it was your turn to actually sleep, good luck. With people moving about, animals rustling and snorting, wind battering the walls, and the occasional sharp nudge from a sibling who accidentally rolled over too hard, getting quality rest was nothing short of a miracle. Yet, despite the pervasive exhaustion, the system worked. Sleeping in shifts meant that there was always a set of weary eyes and cold, begrudging hands ready to keep the hearth alive. The embers survived, and by extension, so did the family. So next time you grumble about waking up to adjust the thermostat, or let the cat out, spare a thought for the medieval peasant squinting into a smoking, dying fire at 3:00 a.m., wondering if toes were really that important after all. You know it's truly cold when you have to actively think about how you breathe just to stay alive. Medieval peasants didn't just battle the freezing air with scratchy cloaks, sputtering fires and creative sleeping arrangements. They even adjusted the very way they inhaled and exhaled to survive the night. The problem was simple and terrifying. Deep, open-mouthed breathing pulled icy air straight into your lungs, chilling your core from the inside. In a world where pneumonia could kill you faster than you could say Hail Mary, that was a risk nobody, absolutely nobody, wanted to take. So peasants learned the subtle, critical art of what you might call survival breathing. Instead of sucking in huge gulps of air like they'd just run a marathon across a frozen field, they kept their breathing shallow, slow, and most importantly, exclusively through the nose. The idea was to gently warm the incoming air a bit as it passed through the nasal passages before it hit their delicate lungs. It wasn't perfect, but it was infinitely better than coughing yourself into the grave by February, racked by an unstoppable lung infection. If you accidentally took a big gasping mouthful of frigid air, congratulations, you just bought yourself a ticket to a week of hacking up bits of what felt like your very soul, with no doctors in sight and only grandma treating you with hot onion tea and very firm prayers. Some people even tucked parts of their cloaks, shawls or rags up over their faces while they slept, creating a makeshift breath-warmer barrier. Of course, this also meant you often ended up with a damp, slightly soggy fabric patch clinging unpleasantly to your mouth by morning. But hey, it beat freezing from the inside out. Children were taught these crucial tricks early on. Parents would scold little ones for panting like dogs indoors during the cold months, knowing the deadly consequences. And honestly, between strict breathing lessons, itchy wool layers, and sleeping next to an aggressively gassy goat, medieval childhood winters were character building on a whole different, rather pungent level. At night, tucked into rough straw bedding, under piles of scratchy cloaks, and next to a gently steaming cow, breathing became an almost unconscious art form. Slow, steady, nose only, and as minimal as humanly possible. Like some grim medieval version of a yoga retreat, only with more frostbite and significantly fewer inspirational quotes. In the grand survival playbook, it wasn't the flashiest strategy, but it worked. One shallow, careful breath at a time, peasants endured another night in the long, relentless, and unforgiving war against winter. In the endless battle against medieval winter, peasants discovered an unlikely, yet incredibly effective secret weapon: a full stomach. It turns out one of the best ways to fight off the relentless cold wasn't just another scratchy wool cloak. It was stuffing yourself with something hearty and heavy right before bed. Calories quite literally meant warmth. The more your body had to digest, the more it generated internal heat, doing the metabolic work to keep you warm. It was basic medieval thermodynamics: eat a heavy meal, generate internal heat, and maybe, just maybe, survive until morning without turning into a peasant-shaped popsicle. So what did medieval peasants pile onto their plates before a long freezing night? Think thick, unappetizing stews, heavy with whatever root vegetables were still available. Turnips, onions, and parsnips were staples. Grains were absolute lifesavers too. Oat porridge, coarse barley gruel, or dense, chewy rye bread were common. If you were especially lucky, say after a rare festival day or a generous animal slaughter, you might even get a hunk of salted pork or a slice of dried sausage thrown into the pot. This wasn't comfort food in the Instagram sense, with delicate presentation or artisanal garnishes. No, it was one enormous, vaguely brown, relentlessly bland meal, designed specifically to sit in your gut, like a friendly, slow-burning brick. slowly releasing warmth throughout the night and keeping you just a little bit warmer. It wasn't just about eating a lot. It was about eating smart. Foods that took longer to digest provided a slow, steady trickle of warmth. Fatty foods were particularly praised, not just for the raw energy they provided, but because fat burns slower than lean meat, sustaining internal heat for longer periods. A belly full of stew, heavy bread, and a questionable amount of rendered lard was the peak of medieval winter luxury. Parents made sure even the pickiest children ate heartily. Nobody cared if little Thomas didn't like turnips. You ate the turnips, or you shivered through the night thinking about how much you missed the turnips. Harsh but undeniably effective parenting, medieval style. Of course, heavy nighttime eating came with its own unique hazards. You might be warmer, but you were also risking a night of vivid, bizarre, and likely unsettling dreams, fueled by a stomach trying desperately to process an entire field's worth of boiled cabbages. Was it worth it? Absolutely, because in the end, peasants weren't aiming for a Michelin star meal, they were aiming to survive. And if that meant going to bed full, bloated, and breathing gently through your nose next to a steaming cow, well, that was just another night in the ongoing quest to see another frosty sunrise. Long before electric blankets and fancy heated mattress pads, medieval peasants had to get incredibly creative if they wanted a little extra warmth at bedtime. And that's how the humble haybox and the ever-glamorous heated stone became winter's unsung, essential heroes. Let's start with the haybox. It sounds rustic, and it absolutely was, but the underlying idea was pure genius. Peasants would take a sturdy wooden box, often just a simple crate, and line it thickly with hay. They'd then use it to store food that had been cooked earlier in the day, keeping it warm for hours. Leftover stew, hot porridge, toss it into the haybox, cover it up, and it stayed hot enough for a late-night snack without needing to risk the dangerous and laborious process of reigniting the main fire. Medieval slow cookers, basically, designed for efficiency and safety. But peasants didn't just stop at food storage. They quickly realized that if hay could trap the heat from a stew pot, it could also trap the heat from something even better: rocks. Enter the era of the heated stone. Before heading to bed, someone, probably whichever unlucky child lost the latest family argument, would grab a flat, reasonably sized stone and chuck it directly into the heart of the hearth fire. After roasting it until it was nearly too hot to touch, a fine line between helpful and third-degree burn, they'd carefully fish it out using a stick or some old tongs. The stone, still radiating blissful, life-saving warmth, would then be meticulously wrapped in rags, tucked into an old piece of cloth, or sometimes jammed into a clay pot to contain its heat. This warm package was then slipped under the hay in the mattress or down at the foot of the bed, a medieval heating pad, ready to do battle against the frozen earth. Of course, there were risks. If you didn't wrap the stone properly, congratulations, you now had a small, localized house fire smoldering under your bedding. And if you dropped it on your bare foot while half asleep, well, let's just say winter injuries weren't always caused by slipping on ice. But when everything went right, that heated stone provided precious, comforting warmth that could last for hours. It wasn't luxurious by any stretch of the imagination, but when you lived in a half-frozen hut, luxury was defined simply as not waking up with icicles dangling from your nose. In the grand arsenal of medieval winter survival, a hot rock tucked into some hay might not sound glamorous, but for peasants clinging to whatever heat they could find, it was a tiny, hard-won miracle. In a medieval peasant's home, the hearth wasn't just where you cooked dinner. It was practically a family member. A temperamental, smoky, sometimes uncooperative family member, sure, but still absolutely essential to survival, especially when it came time to sleep. The closer you were to the fire, the better your odds of waking up unfrozen. That meant sleeping arrangements were less about personal preference or individual comfort, and more about strategic positioning, a careful calculation of warmth distribution. Infants, the elderly, and anyone sick or frail got first dibs on prime real estate nearest to the sputtering flames. Parents, older kids, and sturdier adults fanned out from there, acting like human insulation layers, creating a defensive perimeter against the cold. Being assigned a spot close to the fire wasn't just kindness, it was basic, brutal survival math. Babies were fragile heat generators, and elders were precious repositories of family knowledge, and let's be honest, the best gossip. Protecting them with prime warmth was non-negotiable. But it wasn't all cozy toasting by the flames. Too close, and you risked waking up with your hair singed, your rough wool cloak smoldering suspiciously, or even severe burns. Too far, and you were basically camping in an icebox, with the cold seeping into your very bones. It was a delicate, nightly dance. Stay near enough to bask in the fire's meager glow, but not so near that you had to explain to your neighbor why you now looked like a half-cooked roast. The fire also didn't spread warmth evenly. It mostly roasted the people directly in front of it, while everyone else fought over the narrow cone of heat, like cold lizards jostling for a sunbeam on a frigid rock. If you were lucky enough to fall asleep facing the fire, you might have one blissfully warm side, and one side frozen so solid you could probably knock on it. Pets and livestock, of course, muscled in too. A dog might wedge itself between you and the fire, its tail wagging dangerously close to the open flame. Chickens, sometimes perched perilously on hearthstones, clucking softly into the night, like tiny feathery guardians of warmth. Every crackle of the logs, every shift of the glowing embers, was a tiny fragile promise. You're still alive, you're still warm, for now. And so peasants drifted into uneasy sleep, lulled by the fire's pops and hisses, each breath forming small clouds in the frigid air beyond the fire's fragile circle. It wasn't perfect. It certainly wasn't comfortable. But it was life, clinging to warmth by a thread of glowing coals in the merciless medieval winter. In the medieval world, no one survived winter alone, unless they genuinely wanted to become a very stylish frozen statue by January. Survival wasn't just a family affair. It was a village-wide project, a messy, muddy, loud collaboration where everyone's warmth and life ultimately depended on everyone else. The peasants knew, deep in their bones, that in the dead of winter, a strong fire and a pile of hay could only do so much. If your neighbor's house went dark, you noticed. If the thin plume of smoke from old Tom's hearth suddenly stopped curling into the sky, someone went to check. And not just because Tom might owe you a chicken, though that might certainly be part of the motivation. It was because community, in its most raw and essential form, meant survival. Villagers often had unofficial winter watchers, often the young, the elderly, or those unable to work the fields vigorously, who could keep a vigilant eye on who was coughing too hard, who hadn't come to barter at the market in a few days, or whose home looked a little too still in the morning frost. These people were the medieval version of neighborhood patrol, minus the reflective vests, plus a lot more sheep. If a family's fire went out, it wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a near emergency. A good neighbor would immediately rush over with a glowing coal bundled carefully in rags, or better yet, invite the freezing family into their own smoky, already overcrowded hut for the night. Yes, it meant squeezing an extra 4 or 5 bodies into an already impossibly cramped space, but it was infinitely better than finding frozen friends and neighbors come spring thaw. Communal food stores also played a critical role. During especially brutal winters, villages sometimes pooled their last salted meat, meager grain supplies, and dried vegetables. It was grim charity. No one had much to spare, but a few communal meals could genuinely be the difference between staggering into spring or not making it at all. Even children understood the stakes. They helped deliver firewood, shared precious embers from their own hearths, and ran urgent messages when someone needed help. No one was too small or too tired when winter came knocking with its icy fist. Sure, medieval villages weren't all sunshine and hugs. Feuds happened, disputes over land, goats, or who borrowed whose good cooking pot never truly went away. But when the nights grew deadly cold, old grudges were often quietly shelved, deemed secondary to the overriding imperative of survival. After all, an old rival was still a human being worth saving, because tomorrow it might be you needing rescue in the icy heart of winter. In the end, the village became one big, stubborn, often dysfunctional, sometimes hilarious, but always fiercely determined family, pushing to survive together, one muddy boot, one crackling ember, one frozen smile at a time. When medieval peasants faced the merciless, suffocating cold of winter, they didn't just pile on cloaks or stoke the fire, they prayed a lot. Because when the wind howled like hungry wolves outside your paper-thin walls, and the fire shrank into sullen, almost defeated embers, you desperately wanted every possible advantage, including a little divine intervention. Faith wasn't just a Sunday affair back then. It was woven into every frozen breath, every shivering moment. Before crawling under layers of damp straw and scratchy wool, families would kneel together, offering up hurried, heartfelt prayers to keep the fire burning, the roof miraculously intact, and most importantly, their toes still attached by morning. Saints became more than distant, holy figures. They were winter's frontline defense, specific patrons invoked for specific protections. Saint Blaise, for instance, was frequently called upon to protect against throat ailments, not a minor concern when one deep mouthful of icy air could land you coughing up your very soul. St. Nicholas wasn't just the jolly gift-giver of later legend. He was also invoked to protect households from sudden ruin or disaster during the lean, deadly months. Superstitions wrapped themselves snugly around daily survival, providing an extra layer of perceived protection. Some families sprinkled a little holy water near the hearth before sleeping, hoping it would ward off evil spirits or, at the very least, mischievous drafts that found their way through the cracks. Others marked doorways with blessed chalk after certain feast days, pleading for warmth and luck to find their way inside. Candles played a significant role too. Special vigil candles, often blessed by the local priest or the most pious old woman in the village, were sometimes kept burning throughout the long, dark night, a flickering, defiant plea against the cold darkness clawing at the walls. And of course, no serious winter prayer session was complete without a few desperate promises. Dear Lord, if you just get us through this night, I swear I'll be kinder to my neighbor, even the one who keeps stealing our turnips. Faith wasn't some abstract theological comfort. It was a daily, urgent conversation, a desperate bargain for one more day of life. The peasants weren't asking for luxury, just survival, a little heat, a little food, and one more day to muddle through until spring finally broke the frozen grip on their tiny villages. It was simple, raw hope, whispered into the smoky rafters, tangled in breathless prayers, and tucked under itchy blankets that somehow, miraculously, carried them through the endless, merciless nights of winter. For all the ingenuity, the fervent prayers, and the sheer stubbornness medieval peasants threw at winter, the stark, chilling truth was that sometimes it simply wasn't enough. And when winter won, it didn't just take a few unlucky souls, it took entire families, whole villages, vanishing them into silence beneath a heavy, unforgiving shroud of snow and ice. Some winters were particularly cruel, etched into the collective memory as periods of unimaginable suffering, like the infamous Great Famine winter of 1315. Torrential rains destroyed crops, livestock starved, and freezing temperatures turned an already brutal existence into a slow, grinding disaster that pushed humanity to its absolute breaking point. People were so desperate that stories whispered of eating shoe leather, tree bark, and in the most horrifying, unspeakable cases, each other. Failure to keep the meager fire alive wasn't just an inconvenience, it was often a direct death sentence. Without the hearth's meager warmth, families huddled together for the final time, succumbing to the cold. Neighbors would sometimes stumble across whole households in the spring, their bodies still locked in one another's frozen embrace, as if desperately trying to share just a little more heat until the very end. Houses themselves, flimsy and ill-constructed, could collapse under the crushing weight of heavy snow or battering ice storms. A roof giving way in the middle of a frozen night wasn't just catastrophic, it was often fatal, burying the inhabitants in debris and snow. Dragging yourself through thigh-deep snow to beg shelter from neighbors wasn't a guarantee either, especially if those neighbors were already stretched to their own breaking point. Disease, ever the opportunist, thrived in the cold too. Starvation weakened the body's defenses, and cramped, smoky, unhygienic homes turned into perfect breeding grounds for pneumonia, bronchitis, tuberculosis, and other deadly infections. A simple cough in December could easily morph into a funeral by January, and then there was the quiet, insidious horror of frostbite. Fingers, toes, even ears blackened and died while still attached to their owners. A slow, agonizing process. Some villagers survived winters at the cost of their limbs, a grim badge of honor that said, "I made it through, but winter took a piece of me." Yet what's most haunting isn't just the sheer scale of death, it's the eerie normalcy of it all. People accepted that each winter, some among them wouldn't see the spring thaw. Death wasn't unexpected, it was just another neighbor at the door, wrapped in frost, patiently waiting its turn. Even amid the bitter cold, the constant threat, and the omnipresent smell of smoke and despair, medieval peasants pressed on, stubborn, grieving, yet desperately clinging to life. Because as long as there was one ember left in the hearth, one breath hanging in the frozen air, there was still a fight worth fighting. When we look back at medieval peasants, those muddy, frostbitten survivors of countless brutal winters, it's tempting to see only their hardships, the cracked hands, the frozen toes, the smoke-choked huts, the constant fight against the elements. But buried deep beneath all that struggle, all that discomfort, is something far more powerful, a legacy of raw, stubborn ingenuity and unbreakable human endurance. They didn't have central heating, thermal jackets, or cozy memory foam mattresses. They didn't even have the luxury of assuming they'd survive until spring. But what they did have, and what they left behind, was a profound blueprint for resilience. Every hay-stuffed mattress, Every carefully fire-banked ember, every moss-crammed wall gap, was a testament to human creativity under unimaginable pressure. Faced with seemingly impossible odds, they didn't collapse in despair. They adapted. They learned from the unforgiving land, from each other, and from the bitter lessons carved by each brutal winter. Their communities were built on something far stronger than shared land or common interests. They were built on shared survival. They taught each other to watch over the sick, to pull resources when food ran low, to trust that helping a freezing neighbor today meant someone might, just might, help you tomorrow. They lived by the fundamental understanding that no one beats winter alone. Their faith, too, was a kind of endurance. They wove prayers into their daily lives, not just out of fear, but out of a fragile, stubborn hope. Hope that tomorrow might be a little warmer, a little brighter. Hope that after 100 dark nights, spring would indeed come again, and life would find a way to push through the frozen ground. And somehow it did. Because of their sacrifices, because of their unglamorous, often brutal victories, surviving one more night, one more storm, future generations thrived. Bit by frozen bit, they pushed humanity forward, enduring winters their ancestors could barely survive, until warmth and comfort became common expectations instead of distant, unattainable dreams. Their blood, sweat, and ingenuity are stitched invisibly into the very fabric of the lives we live now. Every cozy blanket, every warm house, every lazy winter evening spent sipping tea under soft lights, all of it is the end result of countless medieval peasants refusing to give in to the cold, stubbornly insisting on seeing another sunrise. So the next time the wind howls outside your double-paned window, maybe spare a thought for them, the nameless, fearless ones who turned shivering survival into a living legacy, one ember, one breath, one stubborn heartbeat at a time. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little darker, a time of plagues, punishments, and pottage. We're diving into what life was really like during the Middle Ages. Forget the castles and chivalry Hollywood sold you. The truth, you probably wouldn't last a single day. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1325. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? So are the fleas. Your bed is a half-rotted straw mattress stuffed with bugs and hay that smells like a barn floor, because it was a barn floor 3 months ago. There's no memory foam, no pillows, and definitely no Egyptian cotton sheets. Just a wool blanket that hasn't been washed since last winter, and now weighs roughly as much as a small cow from the accumulated grime. You blink awake as the church bell clangs in the distance. It's the medieval version of an alarm clock, only louder and somehow even less merciful. Your home is a wooden hut with one room, no windows, and a charming open-concept floor plan, where your family, livestock, and domestic insects all share the same space. The smell? Oh, it's a fragrant symphony. A subtle blend of stale beer, human sweat, goat, and something you pray isn't mold, but know in your soul probably is. Scented candles haven't been invented, and even if they were, they'd just melt on your dirt floor. You try to stretch, but immediately regret it, because the air is freezing and your joints ache. You're 22 years old, which in medieval terms is roughly middle-aged. Your spine creaks like an old wooden door, and your knees sound like a bag of rocks being shaken by a confused peasant. Getting out of bed is a gamble. The floor is either wet from last night's rain which leaks through the thatched roof, or crusty from something your neighbor's chicken did. Either way, your bare feet are now part of the ecosystem. Oh, and privacy, what's that? Your entire family, and maybe a random cousin who just never left, are waking up beside you. There's no bedroom, no curtains, no me time, just communal everything. Welcome to morning in medieval Europe, where you're never truly alone, because parasites, rodents, and 8 other people are always with you. And this is just how your day starts. It only gets worse from here. So you've managed to crawl out of your medieval haystack of horrors. Congrats. Now nature calls. And it's not calling politely. It's screaming. Here's the part where you start missing the modern bathroom. There's no toilet, no seat, no toilet paper, no flush, not even a mildly resentful plunger in the corner. In the 14th century, relieving yourself is an adventure, a social experiment, and often a small public event. If you're a peasant, your bathroom is likely a wooden bucket behind the house, which is already full. Because Uncle Wolfston had a rough night after eating bad turnips, the smell is biblical. You hold your breath, do your business, and then, here's the kicker, toss it into the street. Yes, the street. You're supposed to shout something like Gardilou before dumping it out the window. That's Old French for watch out below, although frankly, no one ever moves fast enough. Streets in medieval towns are open sewers, a charming river of human waste, animal droppings, and mystery liquids you'd rather not examine. If you're lucky enough to live in a town with public latrines, congratulations, you get to sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers in an outhouse where privacy is a myth and ventilation is a cruel joke. You might make small talk, but try not to breathe too deeply. Toilet paper, never heard of it. Most people wipe with straw, leaves, rags, moss, or if they're feeling especially indulgent, a scrap of wool, sometimes nothing at all. Which might explain why handshakes weren't popular yet, and if you're in a castle, surely it's better, right? Well, sort of. You might have a garderobe, a hole in the wall that drops your waist directly into the moat. Great idea, except that your enemies know this, and yes, attackers sometimes climbed in through the waste chute. Talk about entering through the back door. So whether you're a farmer or a baron, medieval toileting is a humiliation ritual. It's cold, it's public, it's dangerous, and it's never not disgusting. One slip on a wet stone path, and you're face first in humanity's leftovers, and you still haven't brushed your teeth, but we'll get to that next. You survived the toilet. You deserve a reward, right? Maybe a nice breakfast. Something warm, delicious, comforting. Sorry, this is medieval Europe. Nothing is comforting here. Breakfast, if you can call it that, is a grim affair. There are no eggs Benedict, no coffee machines sputtering awake, and certainly no avocado toast. You sit down, or squat, near the fire to a wooden bowl of something that looks like it was scraped off a muddy boot. Welcome to your daily ration of pottage. Pottage is a thick, gloopy stew made of whatever you can find. Grains, root vegetables, maybe a few beans if you're lucky. It's been simmering in the same pot for days, sometimes weeks, and new ingredients are just dumped on top of the old ones. It's less of a recipe and more of an ongoing edible experiment. On the side, a hunk of bread so hard it could deflect arrows. It's made from coarse rye or barley flour, often bulked up with sawdust, ground up acorns or other creative ingredients, because wheat is a rich man's fantasy. This loaf is not your friend. You don't slice it, you negotiate with it. What about drinks? You're not sipping orange juice or an oat milk latte. You're drinking beer. Yes, beer. At 6 a.m. Why? Because the water is teeming with parasites and filth. So you start your day with weak ale, low alcohol, high survivability. Kids drink it too. No one's happy about it, but at least it won't kill you immediately. Want some meat or cheese? Dream on. That's for Sundays and saints' feast days, and only if your lord is feeling generous. Most peasants don't eat meat more than a few times a year. As for fresh fruit, only when it's in season and not already fermented into wine, and don't even think about spices unless you're royalty. A pinch of pepper costs more than your monthly wages. Salt is valuable enough to be locked away, so you chew your gritty bread, gulp your medieval beer, and try not to think about the rat that may have nibbled your porridge in the night. Breakfast doesn't energize you, it just happens to you, and now that you're properly underfed, it's time to work like your life depends on it, because it absolutely does. So you've eaten your sad medieval breakfast, and now it's time to get dressed. Not that it'll help. Your wardrobe consists of exactly one outfit. One, it's a rough wool tunic or linen shift that you've worn every day for months, possibly years. There's no such thing as seasonal fashion. There's just wear this until it disintegrates or gives you a fungal infection. Underwear, optional. If you're lucky, maybe a linen undertunic. If you're not, well, you're going commando under layers of scratchy, sweaty wool, all lovingly stitched together by someone who probably had no idea what a seam was supposed to look like. There's also no washing machine, no soap, and absolutely no dry cleaner in sight. So your clothes are stained, stiff, and scented like a compost pile that's been left to marinate in a pigsty. Even if you wanted to wash them, it's not easy. You'd have to haul water from a river or well, heat it over a fire, scrub your tunic on a board with ashes or lye, and hang it in the sun, which is out approximately 3 days a year. And don't get me started on shoes. If you own any, they're made of untreated leather, barely stitched together, and offer as much arch support as a banana peel. Most peasants just go barefoot, through mud, through dung, through medieval landmines, aka sharp rocks and disease puddles. All this means one thing: your skin hates you. You itch constantly. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs live rent-free on your body. Everyone has them: nobles, lousy monks, itchy children, walking insect farms. No one escapes. You'll be scratching your armpit with a wooden spoon while chatting with the local priest, and no one will even bat an eye. Your skin is raw from rubbing, your scalp a battlefield of bites, and if you develop a rash, well, too bad. There's no dermatologist, no hydrocortisone, no one to tell you it's probably scabies. You just keep on suffering, and if you're lucky enough to not get an infection, great, that rash will simply accompany you for the next 6 months, like an unwanted medieval sidekick. Now that you're dressed in misery and wrapped in discomfort, it's time to head outside and start working yourself to death. Now that you're fully dressed in itches and damp wool, it's time to flash that morning smile. Except you don't, because in the Middle Ages, smiling is a dangerous game. Not emotionally, dentally. There's no toothbrush, no toothpaste, no mouthwash, no floss. The concept of oral hygiene is about as popular as bathing, which is to say, not very. Some people might chew on a twig, or rinse with wine or vinegar, but for the most part, your teeth are on their own, and they're not doing well. By the time you hit your mid-20s, your smile looks like something pulled from a haunted crypt. Cavities are rampant, gums are swollen, and those aren't just food stains on your teeth, that's decay. You have more rot in your mouth than a medieval root cellar. Sugar, while not yet everywhere, is becoming more common among the rich, imported at great cost, mostly used in small cakes or to show off wealth. If you're a noble, congratulations, you get to rot your teeth faster than the peasants. If you're poor, you'll do it slowly over time with fermented bread, gritty porridge, and years of hard chewing. Toothaches, get used to them. They're like medieval weather, always there in the background. The kind of pain that makes you consider praying, drinking, or pulling the tooth out yourself with a pair of pliers. And that's not a joke, that was the actual treatment. Dentists didn't really exist, but barber surgeons did. Yes, the same guy who cuts your hair is also pulling your molars out by candlelight with an iron hook and zero anesthesia. Infected tooth? Hope you like fevers, because without antibiotics, it can easily turn into sepsis and kill you from a toothache. That's right, the same thing that sends us to a pharmacy today could be your funeral in the 1300s. And there's no relief on the social front either. Kissing, good luck, halitosis, bad breath is everywhere. If you're single, you're not judged by your smile, you're judged by your land and your livestock. In short, your mouth is a battlefield, and it's losing the war. Now that your teeth are throbbing, let's head outside, because your real job, the one that will break your back, is just getting started. Time to head to work, except there's no office, no desk, no coffee break, and no chance of promotion. Your job, if you're like 90% of the population, is simple. Don't die while laboring for someone else's comfort. You're a peasant. Congratulations. That means you work the land that belongs to a lord who probably doesn't remember your name. You rise with the sun and stop only when it disappears behind the trees. Your tools? A wooden hoe, a rusty sickle, and whatever bones are still intact in your body. There's no weekend, there's no clocking out, there's only sunrise to sunset. 6 days a week, Sunday is off, but only if you're not harvesting, fighting off raiders, or praying feverishly for your infected toe to stop turning black. The work is brutal. Fields are plowed by hand, or with oxen if you're rich enough to afford one. You dig ditches, sow seeds, pull weeds and carry water until your spine begins to resemble the letter S. No one cares if you're tired. No one's asking how your mental health is doing. If you're a woman, surprise, you don't just do field work. You also care for children, clean, cook, spin wool, feed animals, and pretend your husband's lice infestation isn't slowly migrating to your side of the bed. Children, they start helping out around age 5. No school, no toys, just a tiny wooden rake and a dream of one day not dying of the flu. And if you're one of the few who isn't a farmer, maybe you're a blacksmith, a tanner, or a cooper, great, you still work with fire, chemicals, or animal guts all day in poorly ventilated sheds. The pay? Basically survival. The perks? Occasional bleeding. Break a bone? Too bad. Get a fever? Drink some warm beer and keep going. You can't afford to stop, not even for a day, because if you don't work, you don't eat. And if you don't eat, well, medieval Europe has a solution for that. It's called being replaced. So you grip your shovel, ignore the blisters, and keep digging. Because in the Middle Ages, your job isn't a career, it's a slow-motion endurance test. Now that your back is on fire from laboring in the fields, let's talk about the weather. Because in the Middle Ages, temperature is less about seasons and more about ongoing punishment from the sky. Let's start with winter. There's no insulation, no central heating, and no weatherproofing. Just wooden walls with gaps you could throw a chicken through. Your windows are covered with cloth, not glass. The fire in the hearth? Nice in theory, but you don't have enough firewood to keep it going, because wood is expensive, and gathering it from the forest is sometimes illegal. Yes, you can be executed for picking up the wrong stick from the wrong forest. You bundle up in your one damp wool tunic, huddle near the dying embers, and still wake up with your nose frozen. Your feet are permanently cold, often damp. Your fingers so stiff they feel like tiny medieval popsicles. Frostbite isn't diagnosed. It's just called bad luck. Now fast forward to summer. Sounds better, right? Wrong. In summer, your home turns into a clay oven. There's no fan, no cross breeze, and absolutely no deodorant. You sweat through your layers, but you can't remove them because showing too much skin is scandalous and also invites sunburn, insect bites, and social judgment. The flies are out in full force, attracted to your unwashed body and the smell of last week's goat stew that's still fermenting in the corner. Mosquitoes buzz by your ear while you sleep, assuming you can sleep through the sound of your neighbors yelling and babies crying. In the fields, the sun bakes you. No sunblock, no hat unless you fashioned one out of straw like a desperate scarecrow. And the worst part, you still have to work. Heat stroke is just called taking a bad turn. So you're either shivering in your own hovel, wondering if your toes will make it to spring, or you're sweating through your only pair of socks while your thighs chafe into oblivion. And the one thing that never changes, no matter the season, your clothes still itch, your food is still terrible, and your next job still waiting. Welcome to climate control, medieval style. There is none. Feeling thirsty? Need to freshen up? Want to splash a little water on your face to wake up from this damp fever dream of a life? Too bad. In medieval times, water isn't your friend. It's trying to murder you quietly. Let's start with drinking. The nearby stream looks fresh, bubbling and clear, like something out of a fantasy movie. But spoiler alert, it's not. Upstream, someone just dumped a chamber pot into it. And if not that, then a dead pig is probably decomposing in it. Parasites, bacteria, and the entire microbial army of medieval Europe are awaiting in every sip. That's why people drank beer. Yes, beer, even children. But before you imagine medieval kids doing keg stands, understand that it was small beer, weak in alcohol, strong in survival. Brewing boiled the water so it was safer than whatever flowed through the town ditch. Wine was another option, if you were rich enough to afford it and unconcerned with functioning properly before noon. What about bathing? Surely water was used for cleaning. In theory, yes. In practice, absolutely not. See, back then, people believed bathing actually opened your pores and let the disease in. That's right. Washing yourself was considered medically risky. You were cleaner, apparently, if you never removed the protective layer of filth caked onto your skin. Communal bathhouses did exist, but they quickly gained reputations as places for gossip, scandal, and sometimes full-on medieval extracurriculars. So naturally, the church got involved and shut many down. Even if you did want to bathe, it was a full production. You'd need to fetch water from the well, boil it over a fire, fill a wooden tub that leaked, and then pray no one else in the house used it before you, or worse, after. And rainwater, collected in open barrels where birds poop, insects breed, and moss thrives. Sounds refreshing, doesn't it? So whether it's going in your mouth, on your body, or onto your crops, water in the Middle Ages is less of a life source and more of a gamble. One wrong gulp, and you're spending your final days sweating in a straw bed, clutching your stomach and contemplating all your life choices. Next time you sip tap water, raise a glass for our ancestors. They didn't have the luxury of hydration without hazard. So you drank the water. Or maybe you didn't. Maybe you just stubbed your toe on a rock shaped like disappointment. Either way, you're sick, you need help, you need a doctor. Too bad you live in the Middle Ages, where medicine is really just polite torture with a theology degree. Let's start with the diagnosis. Everything wrong with you, whether it's a cough, rash, broken bone, or the creeping plague, is caused by your humors being out of balance. The four humors were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to medieval science, your health depends on keeping them balanced, like some sort of internal soup. Got a fever? Too much blood. The answer? Bloodletting. That's right. Let's drain your life force into a bowl, using a dull blade or a hungry leech. And yes, barbers were often the ones doing it. Imagine getting a haircut and a hemoglobin extraction in one sitting. 2 for 1, baby. Feeling sad or anxious? That's clearly an excess of black bile. The cure? Laxatives. Maybe a warm herbal purge, or just prayers and a cold compress, while everyone avoids eye contact with you and starts carving your coffin. Now, if you break a bone or get a nasty wound, you're in real trouble. There's no anesthesia, unless you count passing out from pain. Surgery is done with knives that haven't been cleaned since the Crusades. Tools are heated over fire, not for sterilization, but because they just look scarier that way. Antibiotics? Centuries away. Germ theory? Not invented yet. They think disease comes from bad air or God being annoyed with your moral failings. Got a stomachache? Must have been your sinful thoughts. Hope you like confessing while vomiting. If your condition gets worse, you'll be treated with more leeches, possibly some crushed beetles, and a priest at your bedside giving last rites just in case. At this point, they're preparing for the cure known as death. And if by some miracle you recover, everyone just assumes God took pity on you. The doctor takes full credit, and the leech gets promoted. So yes, in the Middle Ages, medicine is less about healing and more about surviving the cure. After a long day of labor, lice, and leeches, it's finally time to eat. You shuffle back to your hovel, stomach growling, ready for the one joy left in life, a warm meal. Bad news, your meal is probably trying to kill you. Let's begin with the basics. Food preservation doesn't really exist. There's no fridge, no freezer, just salt, smoke, or the hope that winter air keeps things fresh. Your meat, if you're lucky enough to have any, has been hanging for days, covered in flies, marinated in questionable brine, and possibly shared with a rat or two. Bread is the cornerstone of the medieval diet, but even that isn't safe. In bad harvest years, desperate peasants bulk it up with bark, sawdust, or even clay to make it stretch. And if it's rye season, there's a bonus: ergot, a fungus that causes convulsions, hallucinations, and sometimes death. It's like eating bread laced with LSD and tetanus. Vegetables, only if they're in season. And you know what's always in season? Turnips. So many turnips. Boiled, mashed, or floating in pottage, which, if you remember from chapter 3, is basically a hot swamp of mystery ingredients that's been simmering since your great-grandfather's funeral. Fruit might be available in the fall, but it rots quickly, and sugar is rare, expensive, and hoarded by the rich to show off their blackened teeth. Dairy is another gamble. Fresh milk spoils in hours. Butter and cheese fare better, but they're loaded with bacteria. People eat them anyway because, frankly, it's either that or chew your boot leather. And let's talk about seasoning. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, or nutmeg, worth more than gold. For the average peasant, flavor comes from onions, salt, if you're lucky, and pain. Most meals taste like wet burlap sprinkled with sadness. But food isn't just a health hazard, it's a political one. Game animals belong to the Lord, not you. Caught poaching a rabbit, you could be fined, imprisoned, or even executed. That's right, your dinner could get you hanged. So as you sit down to eat your grey stew by flickering firelight, remember, every bite is a risk, but you eat anyway. Because in the Middle Ages, food doesn't nourish, it tests you. It's evening now. You've worked, suffered, and barely digested your suspicious stew. You might think the day is winding down, but don't get too relaxed, because God is watching. So is the priest, and so is your neighbor Agnes, who will absolutely rat you out if you miss Mass. In medieval Europe, religion isn't just part of life, it is life. The church controls your calendar, your laws, your education if you can read, your birth, marriage, death, and everything in between. Think of it as your spiritual landlord, and you're always behind on rent. Every day is structured around prayer bells. The town church bell rings in the morning, noon, and night. Not because people need reminders, but because missing prayer is a sin. Forget to bow, sin. Eat meat on a Friday, sin. Think about your neighbor's wife in that one dream, double sin. And yes, hell is very real, vividly real. Priests describe it in glorious detail. Rivers of fire, lakes of boiling blood, demons with pitchforks, and eternal wailing. If the plague doesn't scare you, eternal damnation definitely will. You can't read the Bible yourself because it's written in Latin, a language reserved for monks, clergy, and that one noble kid who's too good for dirt. You rely on the church to interpret everything for you. That means if the priest says your crop failure is because you didn't pray hard enough, well, time to kneel harder. Tithes, a tenth of everything you own, are mandatory. If you grow wheat, you give wheat. If you raise chickens, you give eggs. If you have nothing, congratulations, you're spiritually bankrupt and financially doomed. Holidays, they're holy days, dozens of them, and while they offer breaks from labor, they're not for fun. They're for attending Mass, fasting, confessing sins, and reminding yourself that joy is a dangerous indulgence. Questioning the church is dangerous. Heretics are burned, witches are drowned, blasphemers are flogged, and skeptics are quickly reformed. So you go through the motions. You chant, you bow, you pray that your soul, after enduring this dirt-covered life, might finally land in paradise. assuming the priest likes you, because in the Middle Ages, God may be merciful, but the church, not so much. If you thought being a medieval peasant was rough, try doing it as a woman. All the filth, famine and fear, plus childbirth, subservience and social invisibility. In the Middle Ages, being a woman is like being on hard mode with no health potions and no restart button. From birth, a girl's life path is pretty much locked in. Marry young, bear children, serve your husband, die tired. Education, not likely. Unless you're from a noble family and sent to a convent, your intellectual development stops around the time you learn how to churn butter and patch a tunic. Marriage happens early, really early. It's not weird to be betrothed at 12 and pregnant by 14. It's not about love, it's about land, livestock, and alliances. Your opinion, not required. Once married, you're basically your husband's property. Your job is to produce heirs, feed everyone, keep the house running, and not complain, because complaining might get you branded a nag, or worse, a witch. That label comes with a complimentary drowning or burning, depending on local fashion. Childbirth is a death lottery. There's no prenatal care, no sterile tools, no anesthesia. Midwives do their best, but even minor complications can mean death for the mother, the child, or both. Some women survive 10 pregnancies. Many don't survive 2. But don't worry, once the baby is out, your work increases. Now you have a screaming infant in a lice-ridden hut, and you're expected to nurse, cook, clean, and still help in the fields. You don't get a break, you are the break for everyone else. If you're unmarried, you're suspicious. If you're widowed, vulnerable. If you're outspoken, dangerous. Women who didn't conform were often accused of witchcraft, especially if they had herbal knowledge, a strong personality, or just looked at someone funny on a rainy Tuesday. Even in the church, your role is limited. Nuns lived under strict rules, no speaking without permission, no freedom of movement, and your spiritual worth always ranked below men. In short, if you're a woman in the Middle Ages, you're expected to endure, obey, reproduce, and suffer in silence, ideally while smiling. Because even in a time of universal suffering, women were somehow expected to suffer gracefully. So far, you've battled filth, starvation, social injustice, and possibly a goat. But just when you think your day can't get any worse, here comes violence. Loud, bloody, and often completely acceptable by medieval standards. Let's be clear, the Middle Ages were not peaceful. The idea of law and order mostly meant hope the local lord isn't in a bad mood. Violence is everywhere, in the home, in the streets, on the battlefield, in church disputes, and sometimes in line at the communal bread oven. Crime is common, punishment is brutal, and justice is more performance art than protection. Steal a loaf of bread, you could lose a hand. Accused of lying, your tongue might get pierced. Gossip too much, meet the scold's bridle, a metal mask strapped to your head with a bar in your mouth, for correction of course. Let's say you're accused of something serious, heresy, theft, witchcraft. How do you prove your innocence? By being tortured, obviously. Welcome to trial by ordeal. One version, you stick your hand in boiling water to retrieve a stone. If it heals without infection in 3 days, you're innocent. If not, you're guilty. Another option, you're tossed into a river. If you sink, you're innocent and probably dead. If you float, you're guilty and will be punished anyway. It's like a medieval game show where the prize is survival and the host is actively rooting against you. And if you're sentenced to death, that's a public event. Executions are performed in front of cheering crowds. Hangings, beheadings, burnings. Sometimes people bring snacks. It's the medieval equivalent of cable TV. Domestic violence, completely normal. Husbands were allowed, even expected, to discipline their wives and children. Street fights, commonplace. You could be beaten just for looking the wrong way at a noble's horse. And war, always simmering. Local feuds, territorial disputes, religious crusades. Someone's always marching off to stab someone else in the name of honor, God, or boredom. Violence isn't a breakdown of society in the Middle Ages. It is society. Everyone lives with the constant knowledge that life is fragile, justice is arbitrary, and your neighbor might bash your head in over a pig. So walk carefully, keep your eyes down, and never trust anyone with a club. At this point, you've made it through the lice, the leeches, the laundryless misery, and the looming threat of public disembowelment. But now comes the final chapter of most medieval lives, an early and unglamorous death. If you're alive and still breathing past the age of 40, you're practically a celebrity. You might even be referred to as the Old One, which is less of a nickname and more of a statistical miracle. Let's break it down. The average life expectancy hovers around 30 to 40 years, but that number is dragged down heavily by infant mortality. Nearly half of all children died before reaching age 5. Disease, malnutrition, or one bad winter was all it took. No vaccines, no antibiotics, no hope. If you survived childhood, you entered adulthood already exhausted. Work began as soon as you could walk upright, and by 25, your joints creaked like a monastery door. You might be missing several teeth, a finger, and most of your original optimism. Women faced a particularly deadly gauntlet, childbirth. It was one of the leading causes of death for medieval women. No pain relief, no medical intervention, just prayer, hot water, and someone holding your hand while you bled out on a straw-stuffed cot. For men, the dangers were different, but equally relentless. Farming accidents, infections from minor wounds, a neighbor's drunken rage, a crusade gone sideways. Even walking to the market could be risky if you crossed paths with a bored bandit or an angry tax collector. Death could also come quietly from the plague, which turned cities into cemeteries overnight, or from famine, which could last entire seasons, thinning out entire villages, or from bad luck, like eating spoiled grain and spending your final hours hallucinating and screaming at the walls. And funerals, you were lucky if you got one. Bodies were often buried quickly to avoid disease. No embalming, no polished coffins, just a hole, a few murmured prayers, and a shallow mound of earth if there was enough space left in the churchyard. So yes, in medieval times, life was brutal, short, and constantly under siege by death in all its casual forms. You didn't retire, you just stopped showing up. And speaking of exits, let's move on to your final chapter. The medieval dream dies. So, how's your day been? You've woken up in filth, relieved yourself into a bucket, brushed your teeth with wishful thinking, nearly passed out from hunger, worked until your spine cried for mercy, scratched your way through itchy wool, prayed to not get plague, and barely dodged a public execution for owning a squirrel. Welcome to a single day in medieval Europe, still dreaming of becoming a knight. Think again. That romanticized version of the Middle Ages, gallant swordsmen, noble ladies in towers, heroic battles and feasts in candlelit great halls, it's a myth, polished by fairy tales and fantasy books. In truth, the medieval world was gritty, cruel, and deeply unfair. Hierarchy was everything. If you were born poor, you stayed poor. If you were born rich, congratulations, you had a better chance of surviving, but you were still one bad soup away from dysentery and a hasty burial. Even the nobles weren't immune to misery. Castles were drafty stone refrigerators filled with fleas, smoke, and politically motivated marriages. Sure, you had a fur cloak and a goblet of wine, but also a 50% chance of dying in a skirmish or from an infected splinter. Not exactly luxury. The simpler times weren't simple. They were relentless. Everything took longer. Everything hurt more. Everything from childbirth to chewing came with consequences. Life was survival, not leisure. And if you did find a quiet moment to think, to dream, to imagine something better, there wasn't much you could do with it. No upward mobility, no modern medicine, no internet to Google, "What's this weird rash?" You lived, suffered, worked, and died within a 10-mile radius of where you were born. But here's the wildest part. Through all of this, people still laughed, sang songs, told stories, fell in love, and found meaning, not because life was easy, but because humans are stubborn like that. Even in the darkest chapters, they made space for light. So tonight, when you slip into your clean bed with indoor plumbing, antibiotics, and central heating, maybe say a quiet thank you to the modern world and to your ancestors who fought rats, famine, and feudalism so you wouldn't have to.